Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're going to talk a little bit about soliflores. Yeah, single subject perfumes that are so named because it's basically a sole flower, a solitary flower, hence the French word soliflore. Soliflores used to be among the only types of commercially available perfumery. That is, perfumery that was available for people to buy off the shelf or at a counter. If you want something more complex than a single subject, you often had to make it yourself, or you settled for an eau de cologne, which was one of the few ways people could get complex compositions centuries ago. In fact, the advent of eau de cologne, or echt kölnische Wasser, if you want to use the German, which I'm terrible at, by the way. Echt, I guess is how you say it, echt kölnische Wasser. I'm probably going to have some jackass in the comment section tell me to up my pronunciation game or to speak better. There's been someone going around with different accounts who I've had to block and remove their comments each time they come up, but they always try and troll me with my diction or whatever. And I'm like, look, man, I have a high school education, 2 years of community college, and I'm from Baltimore. You're lucky I even know this much about perfume, okay? So don't split your hairs with me, because splitting your hairs with me is just going to get you sent to the shadow realm, because I do not care. I will just be like, be gone, and smack you away like Ruby Rod from Fifth Element, going bzz, 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 bzz. That's going to be me to you, basically. So don't do that. However, as I was saying, echt kölnische Wasser, eau de cologne, that was the first really complex arrangement of materials that was available for someone to buy. Everything before that, any kind of composed fragrance, was usually bespoke, made by a perfumer for a rich client. Typically, in that time, we still had royals, we still had aristocracy, kings and whatnot, dukes and what have you, and they would have court perfumers, people who were basically on retainer, getting a salary to just be in the court and do whatever whenever asked, right? Hey, I want a new perfume. You should get on that. Sure, right away, boss. And then make a perfume. Unfortunately, those times are gone. So perfumers just can't do that for a living. They have to work for an oil house, or they have to work for a big designer if they have an in-house perfumer, like a Dior or something. Or they go into business for themselves and play the whole artisanal indie thing, and hopefully they get large enough to eventually get bought out by investment capital, like the video I mentioned a few episodes back where I talked about that. It's one of the only ways that a perfumer can really make a career out of what they're doing. They're either employed by a big corporation, they're employed by a perfume house directly, or they manage to launch their own brand and then get bought. So soliflores, on the other hand, were relatively easy to make because they were just a single subject, and perfumers in those antique days really only had to figure out what materials they could add to the flower or subject they're trying to communicate to enhance that material, to make it more present and more lasting on skin without talking over it, without becoming more complex, right? So people were interested in smelling like a rose, like lavender, interested in smelling like lilacs or violets, interested in smelling just of sandalwood, just of frankincense, or a few early complex themes like amber. Amber existed. That's arguably an abstract form because it's multiple things combined together, but same sort of thing, an amber perfume, a patchouli perfume. Those aren't flowers, granted, but we tend to call those soliflores anyway because they act as a soliflore does. Just a vetiver perfume would be another example. Okay, these were things that were relatively easy for perfumers of the day with no knowledge of chemistry, granted, right? Very little, maybe it was alchemy back then, I don't know. But they figured out really quickly what wood choices, what musk choices, what other flowers could be buttressed against the rose material, the jasmine material, whatever they were trying to, again, make their perfume about. It wasn't really until things like the fougere came along, and the sheep, and obviously then the even more abstract forms that don't have a genre, the jikis of the world, right? Just, it smells like jiki, and what's that? A jiki. That's what it smells like. Okay, gotcha, boss. All right, but interest in soliflores has never really gone away. It's waned some as perfumes themselves became more democratized in time. You can thank people like Francois Coty and David H. McConnell of Parfums Coty and the California Perfume Company, later Avon, respectively. Both of those guys decided to really bring perfumes to the masses. Coty would do it through brick and mortar distribution, and David H. McConnell would famously create his social selling business model, which we now call multi-level marketing or soliciting door to door. But both of those allowed more people to have perfumes, and as such, taste in perfume expanded and became more complex and more diverse. Only makes sense, right? Yeah, there were still people out there who had very simple imaginations. No disrespect, okay? I like soliflores too, but there were still plenty of people with very simple imaginations in those days who still wanted to just smell like tuberose, again, just smell like gardenia, etc., etc. So those perfumes were still out there, and even then, the soliflores were always a less expensive choice because they often had less materials in them. Deceptively complex because the number of materials honestly grew once we introduced chemicals and isolates to the perfume game, right? The coumarins, the ionones, things of that nature, okay? The nitromusks. The toolbox grew more complicated, right? But the point was still the same, to make just this thing the focus of the fragrance. But now we had better tools to do that with. Now the thing is about soliflores, some people will look at antique perfumes. I'm not saying vintage, I'm saying antique, because we're talking over a century ago. A lot of people will look at those antique perfumes, right? They'll look at the heliotrope and lilac and lavender and rose and poppy and whatever. They would come in assortments oftentimes. Avon's earlier fragrances did that. They came in little packs of 3, packs of 5. You didn't just get one, you got an assortment. You got smaller bottles, but more bottles for the price of one single bottle. So it was like a Whitman sampler, but it was perfume instead of chocolate. That was a big popular thing. Mary Chess did that a lot too, okay? Perfume also did that with a lot of their early fragrances. Lanvin did it. Not sure if Guerlain ever did that, but the little, what they call vanity sets, right? Because it's several smaller bottles in a collection you buy at a one bottle price. Those vanity sets were very popular, particularly with the person who didn't really know what they wanted to smell like. They didn't want to plunk down on a single bottle of something like Shalimar or a single bottle of something like Emerald. So instead, they could buy a little vanity set that would have 6 perfumes in it or 5 perfumes in it. Here's your heliotrope, here's your rose, here's your tuberose, here's your amber, here's your sandalwood, here's your whatever, and go nuts. Go figure out what you like. Mix them and match them if you want to. It's fine. You know, Perfume had mixed fragrances for a while, which were just that, fragrances meant to be bashed together and layered. Something that we still see modern fragrances doing now. We have the Gucci Alchemist's Garden line, which those are all meant to be layered. Elie Saab had a line of fragrances meant to be layered at one point. So that's still a thing, but it's much easier to do with the soliflores. Again, single subject materials, much easier to do when you have a bunch of abstract fragrances, complex fragrances like Poisons and Bellamy's and all these other rich, heavy, just opaque fragrances. They don't layer too well together. Like you wouldn't layer Antaeus over something, right? You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't layer you wouldn't layer Joy or 1000 over something, right? You wouldn't. Those just stand by themselves. And that's the thing. Soliflores give you that ability to do that. You can have just a honeysuckle fragrance, just a vetiver fragrance, just a sandalwood fragrance, and go bing, bang, boom, have a custom accord all your very own. It's like Fisher Price, My First Perfumer Kit. You've got your little single Soliflores and your little Vanity set, and you're like a little 5-year-old with your Lincoln Logs, and you're playing mad scientist, and you're creating your own fragrance out of multiple Soliflore subjects. Nothing wrong with that. It's kind of cool. For some people, that's as far into the field of perfumery as they're ever going to get, right? So let's not knock it. Now, the thing is about Soliflores, you really have to look at how they're built to understand. The old way of doing Soliflores, which is another thing that people will notice with antique perfume, is that a lot of them have the same base. Now, if you like oak moss, or you like nitro musks or whatever, that's fine. Having all of your various floral fragrances all inevitably dry down to the same oak moss base may be fine for you, especially if you're a real hardcore vintage perfume lover and you love that skin scent of the oak moss or whatever it is. If that's your deal, that's fine. Let my tuberose become oak moss. Let my lavender become oak moss. Let my magnolia become oak moss. Let it all become oak moss. Hallelujah, praise the Lord. Let it all become oak moss, right? But then some people, especially more modern noses, who are used to bases being a little more kind of, I don't want to say ephemeral, but a little more just nebulous, not drying down to a single material that's recognizable, unless you know what Ice Super is, right? Not everybody knows that. Oak moss is pretty recognizable to a plebeian nose, but a lot of our chemical bases these days are not recognizable to the average. The average Joe is not going to know they're smelling cashmeran mixed with timber silk. They're not going to know that. They're not going to know what cashmeran or timber silk even is. But the average Joe will recognize the scent of oak moss, right? They'll be like, hey, that's mossy. What is that? Oh, that's oak moss. Okay. You know, oh, that smells like sandalwood. I know what that is, right? So that makes a lot of the old Soliflores, whether, again, it's a lilac fragrance or a violet fragrance or whatever it is, jasmine, they all inevitably, all roads lead to Rome, right, is the old saying. Well, a lot of them end up taking different roads to the same location. And that can be a problem for some people because they can get bored, right? Now, I'm not saying it's boring to me, but I'm saying that some people can find that boring if all their vintage Mary Chess fragrances all go to the same base. Now, there's another thing I'm leaving out, which I'm going to mention. A lot of times the bases are pre-made too. We don't see that so much today, thanks to all of the various captive molecules and patented this and licensed that, or per stuff from Givaudan, all the Firmenich captives that you have to be with a contract to have access to, blah, 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 blah. But at one point in time, there were pre-made bases, and a lot of perfume houses would buy these bases and then build the perfume out of it. You know, it's like when you buy that little, it looks like a blanket, right, of seeds, and you put that blanket of seeds in the dirt and then put dirt over it, you're going to get an assortment of flowers growing out of that. It's like a little pre-made mesh with the seeds are in the mesh. It's kind of what it is. They'd buy the bases, a famous one being Mousse de Saxe, obviously, a very famous one. They'd buy the Mousse de Saxe base. They'd buy, Firmenich had numbered bases for a while. I've talked to some perfumer friends who mentioned the various numbered bases they had. And you just buy the base, and then again, build your fragrance up from it. And if you're doing a Soliflore, right, a single subject fragrance, oh, that's easy. Here's my base. It's got my pyrrolone, my oak moss, a little bit of tonka in there, some kind of woody material, some kind of nitro musk, dosed in an exact proportion to create this particular base smell, maybe a little bit of tonka tone in there, whatever. And then from there goes your heart notes, your top notes. You build out that tuberose accord. You build out that whatever subject it is. If it's not a floral Soliflore, if it's a vetiver fragrance you're building, right? If it's a cedarwood fragrance or a pine fragrance, whatever. You built it up from that base. Into modern times, though, and this is where Soliflores get a bit iffy. Since, as I said, as the future goes on and fragrances get more chemical and more abstract, a lot of times the interest in the more lucid subject, the more lifelike themes recedes. People, as time goes on, especially into the 70s and 80s, were bored with just rose. We're bored with just anything, whether it's a fruit material, whether it's a wood. They didn't want to just smell like that. To them, that was old man or old woman, right? You ask somebody in the 70s or the 80s if they want to smell like their mom's Yardley's English lavender, they'd say, hell no, I don't want to smell like that. They'd be like, I don't mind lavender being in my perfume, but I don't want to smell like just lavender because that's what grandma always smelled like, just lavender. Or just heliotrope smells like baby powder, right? Just carnation just smells like a bar of soap if it's just carnation, because carnation was a popular odorant for hand soap. Same thing, orange blossom. Just orange blossom smells like a hotel. I go to a hotel and the little bar of soap in the hotel smells like Neroli, okay? So they would avoid that stuff. They would avoid wanting to smell like just iris. So soliflores began to take a bit of a back seat in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, as the more abstract materials, the more complex things took over. But these days, we see a lot of people wanting to go to a more simple, minimalist, sort of clean living, which I put that in air quotes, clean living. They want everything to smell more or less like it came out of a digital hologram, right? They don't want any of the rough earthiness, muskiness. They want to like just spray on a perfume and get this holographic etching of a rose just float in front of their eyes like they're in some kind of sci-fi dystopian movie or something. It's just shimmer in the beam. And we have a lot of fragrances that serve that need by being very front-loaded, right? By being very front-loaded. And this comes into the question that people ask me nowadays. And I've seen this question asked on Base Notes. I actually answered this question on Base Notes with a very well thought out written post that I will cap this video off by recanting the same message to you here. And that's the person asked, a forum, didn't ask me individually, but I've been asked this too off to the side. Why do soliflores always smell so cheap? Why is it no matter what the price point is, right? Whenever I get a fragrance that's just a rose or something, it smells cheap. It smells like air freshener. It smells like a candle. Why is that? And I'm like, it's because the fundamental way modern perfumes are built clashes with the way soliflores must be constructed in order to smell convincingly like what they are. Let me explain that. So modern day idea of a fragrance is whatever your fragrance is, you front load it, and then you use a base that projects the top notes. So the base has no real feel of its own. It's not a sandalwood or oak moss base. It's not a musk base anymore. It's not a mousse de saxe or whatever. It's transparent musk materials. It's ambroxan. It's isoe super. It's the cashmeran. It's dihydromercenol mixed with some other things. It's some kind of thing designed to increase projection off the skin, but not to have anything else to say to add to the conversation. So you'll get a Joe Malone fragrance, very popular line of 1 and 2 subject fragrances. Joe Malone's very popular. They'll do rose in this, tulip in that, whatever and whatever. So they're not exactly soliflores, granted, but they're almost. Then you get Demeter Fragrance Library, you get El Trimmer has some. They're around. You don't really see too many high-end designer, high-end niche. Not very many high-end luxury brands in general doing soliflores. And it's because they don't want to put in the time. They don't want to put in the research to make them good because they don't think there's a market for it. And they see stuff like Joe Malone, and they see how that has a very hardcore cult following, but it is still a cult following. The average Joe doesn't wear Joe Malone. Joe Malone has its Joe Malone audience, right? And it's because They take the subject, the rose, the honeysuckle, whatever they're doing, and they put a bunch of transparent stuff underneath to push it forward. So it's like being thrown at you. But then once you smell it, you smell that rose, you smell that whatever it is, a single subject, that's it. It's linear, it stays the same, no change, it's just that for 8 hours. And that's the thing. People don't realize that the complexity behind the Soliflore is what they don't know they want, right? People often don't know what they want until you sell it to them, right? Someone famously said that. Well, that's what it is. And old perfumers like Jacques Guerlain, like Ernest Daltroff for Parfums Caron, they understood this. So all of those old, ancient, dead and gone Guerlain and Caron single subjects, stuff like Guerlain Rose and Gardenia and Jasmeralda, all long dead, gone Guerlains, all the Caron Rose perfumes and Caron Violetta and all those other single subject Carons, both of those they're all extinct. But if you smell those old examples, you'll know that they do that buttressing thing I was talking about. They do it just like the Cathedral of Notre Dame. If the rose or the tuberose or whatever it is, the amber accord, is the pillar, it's the vaulted room, they have to put the flying buttresses on the side to hold up the walls. And they have to use a bit of nose know-how and a bit of chemistry know-how to make that work. They know materials like lavender have certain odorants in them, right? And they know other materials like sage and patchouli have some of those same odorants, those same chemical compounds. So they know if they take a lavender and put a little bit of sage and a little bit of patchouli, they synergize. They help boost the lavender, but they also build out a bit of a white noise static background. So it isn't just lavender hanging by itself with a bunch of isoe super in the background, right? So it gets nagging and singular and discordant, just straight lavender with nothing else, just an echo of lavender. They know that's not going to work. So they put that little bit of sage in there. They put that little bit of patchouli in there. Obviously tonka, right? All those things share a bit of coumarin. All of those things share a little bit of linalool, which is a primary odorant of lavender. And when you combine them all together, you get a really strong, full-bodied, rich, built-out lavender accord, even though you're not just smelling lavender and a bunch of synthetic musks behind it. You're smelling a way more deceptively complex perfume that's being pitched as lavender, right? Like look at Pour un Homme de Caron, for example. 40% lavandin in that. 40% lavandin, tonka, vanilla, some kind of musk, a little bit of sage. That's really it. So that's a very basic formula. And the fragrance is mostly about lavender. But if you were to try to make a fragrance like that and do a huge, 60% dose of lavender and then stick, again, a bunch of ambroxan behind it or something, do a Joe Malone, basically. If you pull a Joe Malone on that, it's going to have a fan base. People are going to appreciate it. Much smaller number of people. But most people are going to smell that, and it's going to nag them. And it's going to remind them of either an Airwick thing or some kind of Febreze thing, or it's going to remind them of a tree hanging from their rearview mirror in their car. And it's just not going to work because you can't build a Soliflore like that. You're almost stuck using an old world method of that buttressing of synergistic materials. It's the only way you can do it. And unfortunately, in 2024, that's very expensive, very time consuming, and no big corporate investment capital ghoul is going to allow a perfumer to spend a large amount of time developing just a violet perfume for them, because those classically don't sell as well as your more abstract stuff. That's been my video on Soliflores. Hopefully you learned something. Thanks for watching.